Good evening, everyone. It's so lovely to be here at the International Quilt Museum, one of my very favorite places. And I haven't been here in a few years, so it's a great excuse to be back. And thank you so much for the introduction, Maren, and of course for the invitation to be here. And I've had such a pleasure working with you over these last year or so on this project, and it's just a real joy to see it all coming together today. And thank you all for being here this evening to join us to see the amazing exhibition, Amazing Quilts. Several great exhibitions, do take them all in. And also to get to talk about the role of quilts and quilt making during the 1930s. We usually think about quilts in the context of home and women's work, and this is an opportunity to think about how they exist and function symbolically and practically outside the home as well. I am back here because I did my graduate work here, my master's degree in the Quilt and Textile History program. And it's really wonderful to have this excuse to come back and join you all. I began making quilts when I was a teenager. You can see in the, I hope these images are showing up. We know it's quite bright still. In the upper left-hand corner, as a kid who always liked to have a project to work on. So I began my first quilt, I think, when I was around 16. I knew how to sew from a fairly young age, like working on doll clothes and so forth. And my grandmother was a prolific quilt maker, and her mother was a professional quilt maker, working in the 1930s, in fact, as well. So one summer vacation, I was like, I'm going to make a quilt. And I pulled a book off my mom's shelf. My mom had made one quilt at that point in her life. And I was really hooked. I just loved the whole process of choosing patterns, choosing fabrics, cutting it all up, sewing it back together. And I continued making quilts through college, not knowing that even though I was studying history and women's studies, there was such a thing as studying quilts as your academic pursuit. So it was a few years after I was out of college, I heard about the quilt studies program here at the University of Nebraska, which back then was in what we called the International Quilt Study Center in the Home Economic Building, which was really just a room. I know some of you remember it. And on my very first assignment in a class taught by Dr. Patricia Cruz, who some of you will remember, was to conduct an oral history interview with someone who was a quilt maker. And so I chose, and this is from that event, the lower left-hand photo, my grandmother, Esther, who was still living then. Her vision wasn't really great, so she couldn't work on quilts other than she could still put hand sew binding on because she could go by feel. She knew how to do the whip stitch of the binding onto the back of the quilt. But this was her very first quilt, which was made when she was around age 20, 22. So this was in the 1930s that she made this quilt, and I am lucky enough to now own it. And she grew up in a Mennonite family in eastern Ohio, and was very much. It was very typical and fashionable for a young Mennonite woman to make a quilt as she did. That middle shot is in fact from the old storage facility in the Home Economics Building over here on East Campus. And since that time, I've moved on to do a number of things, including continuing to research and write about quilts. My first book was drawn from my doctoral research called Amish Quilts, Crafting an American Icon, which explores what happened to Amish quilts in the 20th century when they were, quote, discovered by the outside world and hung on museum walls and treated like works of art. As Maren mentioned, I'm the host of Running Stitch, which is a real fun project to work on. It's a podcast in partnership with the Quilt Alliance. The Quilt Alliance has an oral history collection of close to 1,300 interviews with living quilt makers, although they're not all living anymore because the project's been going on for about 25 years now. So we dig into the archive, we've digitized all the audio, and it's really fun to then invite some people who've either been interviewed in the past on to listen back to parts of their interview, or invite a contemporary quilter or scholar on, and we listen back to excerpts and chat about quilts. So do check it out if you are a podcast listener. And I'm just thrilled today to see and share with you all my current project, A New Deal for Quilts. It really started out, in fact, drawn from projects like World Quilts, which is the great digital module about quilt history that the museum continues to produce additional modules for. Anytime I wanted a picture, an old-timey picture of someone with a quilt, I could find one in the Farm Security Administration photo archive. The Farm Security Administration was one of the many so-called alphabet soup programs of the New Deal, the FSA. And I'm not going to quiz you on what all of those initials stand for, don't worry. But the FSA had as part of its mission to document the plight of Americans during the Great Depression. And they did this as a PR campaign. It was essentially propaganda. You think about it, government funding photographers to go take pictures of what Americans are doing so that they can promote their programs and also generate empathy towards migrant laborers, sharecroppers, tenant farmers, displaced people. And again, in this photo archive are pictures of people making quilts, people posing with quilts, people using quilts in their homes. And I started with that sort of premise, like, why are all these pictures of quilts part of this government propaganda project? And started there and soon realized that quilts were all over the New Deal programs, not just in this photography project, but in the WPA sewing rooms, the Works Progress Administration sewing rooms, in federal arts project initiatives made by grassroots people in support of various New Deal efforts, sent to the White House as gifts, as thank you gifts to the Roosevelts. And I realized, well, we all knew that quilts were really popular during the 1930s, but I didn't know the extent to which the government was harnessing that popularity for its own causes as well. So this is, my academic-y thesis here. You can read it if you'd like, but essentially the premise is the government recognized how powerful quilts were and began to use them in the relief programs, training people how to make quilts, how to document quilts, how to make quilt patterns, and how to sort of celebrate quilt making as a symbolic act of how to lift your family out of poverty, out of these dire straits, and also soothe the challenges that most Americans were facing during this time period. I started my research in earnest in spring of 2020 when I had my very first sabbatical. Sabbatical is a real treat for a professor because you get to not teach and just focus on your research. I had funding lined up for archival visits to museums such as this one, and as you might expect, everything was canceled. So I had to figure out how to do the project anyway. But what happened was I realized that my research was even more relevant than I had anticipated, because all of a sudden in spring, March, April 2020, the United States has the largest federal relief program since the New Deal. Also in this time period, people are stuck at home wanting something productive to do with themselves, and people start making quilts, just as they start making sourdough bread and learning foreign languages and all the other weird hobbies we picked up during that time. So I love this slide because it's from a 4-H publication where these girls are acknowledging that there are difficulties but encouragement. And I continue to find that encouragement as I worked on this project. And I also dug into my own scrap bag and stitched blocks, and that soothed me as well. I found great comfort. And I found great comfort also in thinking about these Americans from 90 years ago who similarly were persevering and finding ways to cope with the hard times. One of those Americans is Fanny Shaw, and she created this quilt in 1930-32. I think she finished it in 32. She's from Texas, and this remarkable quilt, it looks like a graphic novel or a comic book. She called it Prosperity is Just Around the Corner, which was the name of a very popular song Supposedly, Herbert Hoover said these words. There's no real evidence that they actually came out of his mouth. Herbert Hoover was the president prior to Franklin Roosevelt. In this, Fanny depicts all of the neighbors in her community, including herself and her husband, the farmer, peering around the corner, looking to see if prosperity was just ahead. So she stitched into this both her optimism as well as her frustration with the government. And you can see in the final block, Uncle Sam arriving with legal beer, farm relief, and gold to kind of save the day. So this is just one of the many quilts where women were really stitching their political beliefs, their sentiments about the challenges that they were facing during the Great Depression. Now, not everyone made such kind of didactic quilts that had such a clear message, but as you can explore in the gallery with the great selection of quilts we have here, as well as some that I'll show you today in these slides, there were lots of ways, both subtle and more overt, like this one, many symbolic ways, many practical ways that quilts helped with the relief efforts of the Great Depression. So this is one of the many photographs taken as part of the Farm Security Administration project, here depicting a family finishing a quilt. This is one of the quilts or photos that really suggested to me how intentional and posed these photographs could be. I know you probably can't see that well on these small screens, but the quilting is all complete here. If you know anything about sitting at a frame, you know usually it's you're rolling and then stitching on the other side. They're on the edge where the quilting stitches already are. So this is clearly a posed photograph. And there are many that are similarly posed, and there's different evidence too that I can point out to you. But this just suggests how intentional the use of quilts were in these photographs. There's a few more here that kind of many depict people at work making quilts, as this woman in Jack Delano's photograph from 1941. She's in a smokehouse. This is meat curing around her. This is also a really interesting quilt because at first glance it looks like a patchwork quilt, but if you zoom in, and thankfully the Library of Congress has super high-res versions of these images, you can see that this is not a patchwork quilt, this is printed patchwork. What quilters affectionately call cheater cloth. So who knows what her motivation is? Maybe she was making this for sale. Lots of women during the 1930s picked up quilt making, not because it was their favorite hobby, but because they would try to sell quilts for like $2 or $3 a piece. We also have lots of people posed with quilts, as you see in the middle photograph by Dorothea Lange. This is a Helping Hand Club in Oregon. They made quilts and would raffle them off to help members of their group, really a form of mutual aid. And then there's so many photographs in this collection of just quilts in domestic living spaces, which I think really show how much quilts can soften the harsh environments. Many times people are living in very temporary, precarious housing situations. This is a sharecropper's family. There are also quilts, in temporary migrant houses, quilts in shacks, quilts in tents made of quilts. All of these are parts of the photographs that we see and really sort of serve as evidence for how intentional the photographers were in documenting how people were using quilts in these spaces. Photographers also took many photographs of people at work in government-sponsored sewing projects. On the left, you see a sewing room in Manhattan, New York. So in big cities, there were sewing rooms. There were dozens of sewing rooms throughout New York City. In these sewing rooms, they were usually focused on making garments with industrial sewing machines. There was a lot of mattress making as well. There was a lot of surplus commodity cotton because the price of cotton had dropped so severely that the government sent out cotton that they carded and used as the stuffing to put inside quilts, but also woven cloth that could be made into very utilitarian whole cloth comforters like you see these women working on, and they were distributed to the needy. WPA sewing rooms could not sell any of the products they made. They weren't allowed to compete with the for-profit industrial market. That frustrated industry for sure. They thought, well, you're just giving away all of these garments. Yet it was a really essential part of the New Deal effort. Women could only be employed in sewing rooms if they were the head of households. So if they had either a father or a husband who was able to work, they were not able to get a position in one of these sewing rooms. So they were really coveted. And even if you did get a position, they were sort of limited. The hours would change from week to week. You couldn't have quite very steady work. Sometimes sewing rooms would shut down if the local funding, local partnerships fell through. But it was a really essential way that women who didn't have another support system were able to keep their families afloat. On the right is another quite famous project, also part of the WPA, not technically a sewing room. It was called a handicraft project. And unlike the sewing rooms, these projects made highly designed, almost Bauhaus-inspired, Art Deco-inspired objects that then were sold at cost to state agencies. So like orphanages, hospitals, nursery schools would buy up the quilts. They also made dolls and woven articles, furniture, a whole array of things. There were handicraft projects in about 40 different states, but Milwaukee's was the largest and kind of the model project that other states and cities modeled after. More typically, and this has sort of an array of activities going on in the sewing room from Maryland. You can see some sewing machines in the back, but sometimes there were quilt frames also set up where we see more typical patchwork quilts, almost quilting bee style, being worked on. However, the government actually explicitly said sewing rooms should not be like quilting bees. We don't want women socializing there. I mean, think about it though. Of course they were socializing. I think that was the most essential function of the WPA sewing rooms, was they were a place for women to forge community. They would trade plant starts and recipes and have holiday parties and really have that network that is essential when you're going through hard times. This woman, the younger woman standing in this image, her name is Octa Self, and she had such an amazing, unusual name that I could actually find out a decent amount about her through the genealogies. So she typifies a woman who would get a job in a WPA sewing room. She was the supervisor of what was called in this Nashville sewing room the Quilting Project. She had 5 children by the time she was in her late 30s, and her husband had left her and moved out of state, so she had moved in with her own parents. She had 2 jobs outside of the house, one working in a medical office and one working, I think, as a phone operator. So she was deemed skilled enough to be a supervisor in this project. But it shows just like how this was such an important thing for Mrs. Self to get this position, and then she was working with other older women. I think many of the women who worked in the sewing rooms tended to be older, where they no longer had a husband who was able to support them. But I just love this picture, in part because the monkey wrench, as you see here, or churn dash as it's sometimes called, is one of my very favorite quilt patterns. But it just shows, I'm sure this one is also very posed, but it really shows a very nice intimate moment in a sewing room. So the kinds of things they were making in sewing rooms include, in the foreground here, this cherry quilt was made by the Milwaukee Handicraft Project. So this is a very highly stylized quilt, actually very challenging to stitch. This is all applique. Many of these women had no experience using a needle and thread before, so they had to learn how to do this. There were college-educated artist foremen, as they were called, even though they were all women, who designed the patterns and trained the so-called unskilled women how to create quilts like this. And the way they recalled many decades later in oral histories is that they had so much time, there were no rush, so they made the patterns intentionally pretty complex in this handicraft project. In contrast, the quilt, which you just see a detail of, the tag of in the upper right-hand corner, this even predates the WPA. It's from the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which the WPA would receive federal money to pay the workers, but they had to have local sponsorships. The FARA projects were set up with a slightly different economic model. But this is one of the few existing kind of utilitarian, federally made quilts that I've been able to identify, and it has this great not to be sold label on it. Other women who were really clever took home the scraps from the sewing rooms, which is what Georgia Mize did. So she took the scraps home from the sewing projects, the garment making projects in the sewing room, and pieced her own beautiful quilt. This quilt has the very cute name for the pattern, WPA Tulip Quilt. It was made by Minnie Benberry, who is the mother-in-law of a really noted quilt historian, Questa Benberry, who was really one of the foremost quilt historians, period, but she had a focus on African-American quilt making. So this is a story that's been recounted by Questa. Minnie lived in western Kentucky, a very rural area where many African-American families lived, and a federal worker, who they referred to as a WPA worker, came and brought this tulip pattern to her door one winter. Now, I suspect it might not have actually been a WPA worker, knowing enough about who was sent out into the field. It was probably a Farm Security Administration worker, or maybe even an extension agent, like a home demonstration agent. Federal worker nonetheless. When Minnie Benberry showed up in the churchyard in the spring, when all the women were coming together to quilt the quilt tops they'd made over the winter, they all had made a quilt in this pattern because the WPA lady had distributed the same tulip pattern widely in the region. So they called it the WPA tulip quilt. And this one is borrowed from Michigan State University and then hanging in the gallery. So these workers, federal workers, home economists, taught a lot of skills to the rural women, rural farm women, sharecropping families, really throughout the rural South in particular. And they focused on subsistence home production, which is really interesting because these home economists in like the 19-teens and 20s had really been focusing on consumer culture. They wanted women to be buying more factory-made products and not producing so much at the home. Instead, getting the newest appliances that would make their lives easier. And so then they had to shift and refocus on the production culture once the Great Depression hit. So they focused on gardening. You can see how much canning they did. The shelves are bowed. The Farm Security Administration would provide credit, loans for them to purchase pressure cookers and sewing machines so that they could make more at home. And you can see in the caption here for the photograph, this is the center photograph, the home economist really was championing that she was helping them learn better nutrition for the family as well. And I just love, you can see in the book the full image of this family sitting on their porch with all of their quilts airing out. And this was as part of the same visit that the home economist and the FSA photographer made. Home economists helped in a number of capacities, and they ran clubs, sewing groups, where they often were doing quilting in many communities. The Tigard Valley, a West Virginia community, was one of around 100 planned communities established during the New Deal. This seems so foreign to us in 2023 that the government will come in, and essentially these were collectivist communities where there was a community center. The community center always had a sewing room, usually a home economist on staff in the planned community. And they would divide up the land so that each family had like a small subsistence farm, like an acre of farmland that they could raise enough crops for their own family. There was a big move away from the cash crops like cotton and tobacco that really people thought had contributed to the Great Depression itself. So there was new emphasis on sort of being yeoman farmers, just growing enough to support your own family. So Tigert Valley was one of these communities. It was a former mining community, and when the mines shut down, the federal government bought the land, divided it up into small homesteads, and this is the quilting group that was established there. There were also home economists that went into many of the communities and actually taught classes. This one is a very familiar community to those of you who are quilt enthusiasts. This is Gee's Bend, Alabama. Gee's Bend had been a former plantation. Gee's Bend, you might know, was a very isolated community in southern Alabama. It was difficult to get to because the ferry stopped running, and the ferry had provided the only access across the river. So the federal government bought this former plantation land where people had been living as sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and established one of these planned New Deal communities, subsistence farmsteads, built new cottages for all the families, built a great school and community center, and here we see home economists teaching the young women as part of the National Youth Administration, which was the young people's division of the WPA, how to use treadle sewing machines. Here's another planned community. This one was a segregated community. This is still the Jim Crow South, even though the federal government was committed to equitably providing relief and reform efforts. They deferred to local and regional practices when it came to segregation. So this is an African American community at Flint River Farms in Georgia. And here too we see the home economists instructing women. It's quite a beautiful shot sitting on their front porch. And you can see in the caption that they provided these home economics classes for adults in the community. And these are just a few more images of just how essential the home economists were. I really think they are an under-recognized contributor to a lot of what we consider, Depression-era mentality of frugality and thrift. A lot of this was taught very intentionally by people such as these home economists. And so they would really, it was somewhat paternalistic as well, particularly you see in the shot, the larger shot on the right. This is a white home economist coming in and helping two African American women learn how to make patterns to make clothing. So there was a power dynamic sometimes. The home economists were always college educated, sometimes even at a master's degree, and so then they're coming into these rural communities, and you can imagine some of the tensions that may have ensued as part of this. There were also home economists on staff in Farm Security Administration migratory labor camps. You're probably familiar with the Dust Bowl in this region, which pushed people further west in search of migrant labor. So the Okies and the Arkies are sort of the typical groups that we think of as moving west to California. And at first, many of these migrant workers lived in what were called Hoovervilles, named after Herbert Hoover, the president who preceded FDR. But eventually, the Farm Security Administration thought they needed more stable housing, so they established these camps so they wouldn't have to be living in situations that were beholden to either the corporate farmers that were employing them to pick peas, or in these very ramshackle Hoovervilles. So these camps, ostensibly temporary, were highly designed. They also had centralized community centers, home economics rooms, and the home ec rooms had quilting frames, ironing boards, sewing machines. Here on the left is a woman actually carding some of this commodity cotton to use as the batting inside a quilt. I had the pleasure of reading a lot of newsletters that were published by these camps in California, and the home economists would write about what kind of quilts they were making, and there would be reports on the raffles for quilts, the mutual aid. One camp in particular had a club that they ensured that every new family that arrived at the camp was given enough quilts. Basically, they would check out the quilts, almost like you were checking books out of a public library. So you could check out quilts to use, make sure you could keep your family warm while you were living at the camp. These are a couple other shots of, these are WPA workers also instructing in quilt making and other home economic skills. These are both from Ohio. So these are in the north, but here we again see some of those power dynamics. Home economists in both of these shots are white women assisting groups of African American women in sewing projects and various other homemaking skills. And some of this was intentional with the belief that giving women these new skills would help them be more employable. And probably in some cases this was very true, but we all know it's very hard to make a living off of making quilts. So probably some worked as domestic servants as well and developed other skills that could be employable. There was a hope and a dream that women working in the WPA sewing rooms would find work in the for-profit industry, and that really just didn't transpire. But it did help them keep their families afloat during the Great Depression. There were also federal projects that documented historic quilt making practices. As part of the Federal Arts Project, there was the Federal Writers Project, which employed out-of-work journalists, creative writers, other white-collar workers to interview. They conducted oral histories. The government paid them to conduct oral histories with people all across the United States. A subset of this project is now called the ex-slave interviews, or ex-slave narratives. So people who had grown up during slavery on plantations were interviewed, quite elderly people. If you can kind of ballpark, you know, slavery ends officially in 1863, and so these interviews are really starting in like 1936. So they're quite old, so they're recounting memories of their childhoods. You can see this quote here from Celestia Avery. Everyone would go together to a different person's home on each separate night of the week and finish that person's quilts. Each night, this was repeated until everyone had a sufficient amount of covering for the winter. Any slave from another plantation desiring to attend these frolics could do so after securing a pass from their master. So these interviews serve as a really vital record for understanding the social life and the world within the institution of slavery. You have to take them with a little bit of a grain of salt because many of these writers were known to embellish some of the details. And also there was this power dynamic when a federal worker shows up and asks you about your childhood. Sometimes these people remembered a little bit with rose-colored glasses their childhoods growing up in slavery. Nevertheless, it's a very important resource. So much of what we know about quilt making during slavery is from these interviews, as well as lots of details about life in general. There were another capacity of this Federal Writers Project was called the American Folklore Project. And this one was intentionally asking about traditions and customs. Dorothy West was an out-of-work writer. She was part of the Harlem Renaissance scene, lived in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s. And she was employed by the Federal Writers Project. And she interviewed a woman named Mamie Reese, who had come north to Harlem as part of the Great Migration, the big demographic wave of African Americans from the rural South moving to northern cities. And Mamie also remembers quilting parties in quite vivid detail. Dorothy West was, a published novelist, so again, we don't quite know what might be embellished. But it is a really lovely interview where this woman recounts the very festive parties that they would have. Also, as part of documentation efforts during the 1930s was what's called the Index of American Design. And you can see a little display of some of some objects from the Index of American Design inside the gallery. Essentially, there were art enthusiasts, cultural movers and shakers who wanted there to be a design resource of American art, American folk art, decorative arts, commercial art, so that American artists didn't have to look to Europe for precedents, that they could have a resource of great American traditions. So unemployed artists, often commercial illustrators, but also fine artists as well, were hired to go out and paint watercolor pictures of pieces of decorative and folk arts. There are over 18,000 paintings of such things now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and which includes around 700 paintings of quilts. So this just blows my mind. The government was paying people to paint pictures of quilts. Really quite a crazy prospect. This is one of the artists. His name is Albert Mowry. He worked on the Kentucky Federal Art Project. Yeah, I know, this is such a great picture. He's got a cigarette ashtray right next to his palette, right next to this very historic quilt, probably an early 19th century quilt. I love this example because once I found this picture, I was like, well, I've seen the painting of that, so we can pair these together. What's really great is that took a lot of legwork, but I worked with the archivists at the National Gallery of Art. They have data sheets on each of the objects that have been painting, but they aren't paired with the paintings. So you can look in one database and see all these beautiful paintings, but you don't know anything about the original objects. So they sent me all of these, like 700 PDFs. I said, I want all the quilts. And they gave me kind of a concordance to figure out how to match them up. So I matched up paintings with these data sheets. Sometimes I was really lucky and could recognize quilts. This is a quilt from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this is the rendering of it. You can see a detail, basically, of that corner. This is another really fine example. Some of these are so extraordinary. It's like almost a hyper-realistic paintings. You can see the quilt. I mean, you could easily convince someone that that was a textile, not a painting, right? And these paintings then were exhibited widely across the United States. And this is a newspaper write-up from Pittsburgh about, it mentions this particular artist, Catherine Hastings. There's a lot of skepticism about the Federal Arts Project. Not everyone was on board with the idea that the federal government should be paying out-of-work artists to do things like this. Some considered it a real boondoggle. We look back at the New Deal and think about, how everyone must have been on board with this. It was quite controversial at the time. Kind of similar political environment to what we have now, when there's a lot of division. Yet the government was making really bold actions and had enough legislators behind it to try some of these really crazy experiments, like painting pictures of quilts. I was particularly excited when I discovered this painting of a quilt by Lillian Causey, and it's just called Quilt, but we all recognize it as a Baltimore album quilt, which is a really quintessential mid-19th century, very high-style, fancy quilt. And I knew that quilt because I'd seen it here at the International Quilt Museum. So I love that we have this painting of a quilt, and you can see we reproduced a few of these paintings in the gallery. We don't have the originals, but we used the high-res images from the National Gallery. What I really love here is that we have the data sheet, and this was a quilt that was unattributed. We didn't know who made it, but now we have this little clues to go on because when they recorded the data sheet at the time of this painting was made, and it tells us a little bit about the family that it came from. So there's more detective work to do. I certainly didn't get through all 700 of these data sheets. I'm slowly getting them put up on my own website, trying to pair them with the paintings, but it's been a pretty fun project. There was another documentation project that was part of the museum extension project. So this is another very obscure WPA project that employed white-collar workers. Its intent was to create, kind of like the extension service, the agricultural extension service, was to create resources for public libraries and schools. Schools couldn't afford to have educational resources, so people working on the museum extension project would basically bring objects to schools, like you're bringing a museum to a school. One of the projects in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania was sort of the leading state. They were the model state for the museum extension project, although many states had them. They produced a set of screen-printed quilt patterns that were, there are some full extent sets, probably less than 10 that have been identified. So we don't know how big these how many portfolios were actually in circulation, but some of them ended up at public libraries and schools. There's one set I was able to work with that had names, individual names on each of the patterns, and I found, digging through Ancestry.com, a lot of these names all graduated from the same suburban Philadelphia high school in the 1960s, making them probably born in the 1940s. So they did somehow find their way into schools. I don't know how widespread actual quilt making was, because a quilt guild in southeastern Pennsylvania in the late 80s did a study of these, and they found the patterns to be completely unworkable. Now, there were also huge grassroots quilting efforts throughout the country. People were indeed making quilts. Quilt making was popular. And people stitched their loyalties into these quilts as well. There were probably thousands of quilts sent to the White House, to the Roosevelts, as thank you gifts. It's difficult to document them all because they didn't have quite the same gift registry procedures as they do today, but there's so many examples that I know that I'm only scratching the surface of it. Sometimes you'd see newspaper articles saying, so like the Romeo sisters from California sent this very typical 1930s grandmother's flower garden quilt to Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor was a huge quilt enthusiast. She loved crafts in general. She had her own colonial revival furniture company prior to her time in the White House. Supposedly, she collected quilts. It's hard to actually say if that was true, but she did write about quilts in her My Day newspaper column that was syndicated throughout the United States. But I just love these like flappers, essentially, making quilts, and they're so-called authorities of old-fashioned quilting, and they sent this quilt on. There were also many quilts made in recognition of loyalty to various New Deal programs. We think of the NRA as something else today. In the 30s, it stood for the National Recovery Administration, which was founded in 1933, part of what we call the first New Deal, the first wave. It was deemed unconstitutional by 1935, but essentially you could display the Blue Eagle in your storefront or on the products that you manufactured, and that was a way of saying that you had signed on to these labor provisions that, like a 40-hour work week and so forth. And so there's a huge array of these NRA Blue Eagle quilts. There was not just a standardized pattern, people were making them as a grassroots effort. There were similarly WPA quilts. The sampler quilt on the right you can see in the gallery. The one on the left is another you can see at the bottom. It says WPA USA. So they're really showing their loyalty to this program as well. Then we have, and this quilt is on display here as well, Tennessee Valley Authority, which was an effort to dam the Tennessee River, which runs between Tennessee and northern Alabama, northern Mississippi, in order to provide electricity to these rural areas, and also to create reservoirs that could be used for recreation. The Jim Crow South was very much in existence, and even the villages where the workers lived to create these dams, to build these dams, were segregated, with the black families living on one side of the river and the white families on the other side having different access to amenities. There was a beautification effort that African American women who were married to men working on this project undertook, and they created these highly modernist quilts that really show their loyalty to the TVA and the federal government, but I think they also were trying to say, we deserve more than this. They were empowering quilts. The one on the right is called Black Power. This is before that had even entered the lexicon later in the 1960s. Who knows, there's supposedly rumors that some of the interns who worked on part of the TVA eventually may have become civil rights activists. Who knows if there's anything, if this is the original Black Power fist. There were also quilts that demonstrated political loyalty. The one on the left is from the FDR Museum, and actually recounts in each of those stars the electoral returns from 1936. There was a published pattern in the Kansas City Star of this giddy-up, a very democratic donkey. There was similarly a an elephant pattern published by the same newspaper. And here are just a couple other examples of how people stitched their loyalties, their political loyalties during the 1930s into their quilts. 1932 Lone Star quilt says, "The eyes of Texas are upon you." Garner was Roosevelt's running mate in 1932. He was from Texas. And similarly, the quilt on the right, which we just have a detail of, it says, "States that elected Franklin D. Roosevelt president in 1932, 1936, 1940 elections." And each block says which states voted for FDR's administration. Consumer culture capitalized on this as well. This is a published pattern named in honor of the Roosevelts, a Roosevelt rose. We have a great example of this in the gallery. And then this is a remarkable quilt. It's hard to see the detail on it on the screen, but it's portraits of Eleanor Roosevelt. So it wasn't just FDR that was celebrated, although there were many commercially published quilt patterns that celebrated Franklin Roosevelt as well, including this one, which is made in honor of Warm Springs, Georgia, which is called the Little White House. It's where was a hot springs where he would go to convalesce from his polio. And this is an example of that quilt from the Warm Springs historical site. You might be familiar with the 1933 Century of Progress World's Fair, which was in Chicago, and it had a huge quilt competition that went along with it. And you can see Roosevelt's face here in the quilt on the left. This is just one of many quilts that had something to do with Roosevelt depicted in the quilt pattern. And keep in mind, he was just inaugurated in 1933. This contest gave quilt makers the chance to win $1,200, which would have been like hitting the Powerball in the 1930s. These are a couple examples, and the one on the green quilt calendar you can see in the gallery. Please take a look at the detail of each of these blocks. It really is depicting all the seasons, the months of the year. These are very creative examples that were submitted to the contest, but sadly neither of these won. The quilt that won, you can see here being presented to Eleanor Roosevelt, was quite commonplace. It was a beautifully executed quilt, had some nice stuff work in it. The woman who made it, the woman who submitted it, Margaret Caden, did not actually make it. She employed a staff of quilt makers from her quilt shop in Lexington, Kentucky, who received no credit, none of the prize money, and they were some of these impoverished women, just like the women working in the WPA sewing rooms. And supposedly, Mrs. Caden didn't even like the Roosevelts and was disappointed when this was presented to Eleanor. So if we think back to Fanny Shaw's quilt, I want to end with this really dramatic quilt that sort of is a bookend to Fanny Shaw's quilt. And this you can see in the gallery as well. This is created by Hungarian immigrant Mary Gasparik. And she called it The Road to Recovery. Created it in 1939 for the New York World's Fair that was occurring at the other end of the decade. There was also a big quilt competition as part of this event. And here she depicts this woman. You'll definitely have to go see it in person because you can see the years along the path. It's 1929, 1930, 1931, and so forth, leading up to the symbols of the architecture to the World's Fair. The detail is just astounding, and it really speaks to another American's story of persevering through the Great Depression. So what does this mean for us all today? Well, I have a lot of thoughts about that and about what the federal government can and cannot do, and we do live in quite politically divisive times. Lots of people did start making quilts during the COVID-19 pandemic and really embraced this whole spirit of the quilting bee almost virtually. When we couldn't get together with our guilds and our groups, we used Instagram and had sew-alongs instead. Quilt makers are so generous and made hundreds of thousands of masks. I can't even estimate how many masks quilt makers made digging into their stashes before we had regular factory-produced masks available to us. The quilt on the left, you'll have to look closely at it. There's the virus tumbling down the stairs. This was made for a 2020 contest, a jury contest called Quarantine Quilts. And back in 2020, once people had made enough masks, they started making quilts that really spoke to the elements of the COVID-19 pandemic. These are some of the WPA posters that I've drawn inspiration from as I think visually about this era. These are all about home economics work. There's now today talk of a Green New Deal. I can't imagine it actually happening in our current political landscape when we actually don't have a functioning federal government currently. That said, I'm really curious how we can imagine quilt making and craft making and art making in general fitting in to making our lives and our culture and our politics better. I don't have an answer for this. The NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, they don't fund federal arts projects directly like they did during the 1930s, but they do, like the Humanities Nebraska money that funded this event tonight comes from that NEH pot of money as well. So there are ways, sort of indirectly, that we can continue drawing on the federal government to think about craft making and quilts specifically as well. I'm interested to see where we go with this, how quilt makers can help tell the stories that we need to lift our morale in 2023 and in the years to come.